producer of Cheerios and Annie's Boxed Mac and Cheese, integrated 45 external production lines through contractors since the first round of pantry loading during the spring. Campbell's Soup Company expanded its production of Goldfish crackers and is building capacity for chip brands such as Cape Cod, investing an additional $40 million to keep up with demand. Conagra Brands increased third-party manufacturing and warehousing, while Stonyfield Farm, a producer of organic dairy products, is purchasing more milk from its direct supply network of farms. By contrast, local production has been compromised by several natural disasters throughout the year, and also big manufacturers' orders for farmers to dump production and slaughter their animals due to contractual obligations. For its part, store supply in smaller cities or distant rural areas couldn't afford the same luxury of preparing in advance, considering many of them were never fully restocked since the first round of supply shortages. Meanwhile, major food producers are determined not to get caught off guard again, especially after calculating how much they've lost because they were unable to ramp up production fast enough in March when demand hit record highs. Since then,
when you vote, remember John James said he was
supporting our president's agenda 2,000%.
That wasn't friendly protesters. They were thugs. These are acts of domestic terror.
You have to dominate.
And James still supports Trump.
They've boosted their production of dried pasta and canned soups and used a calmer summer to reevaluate the new grocery landscape and rethink their approach, namely, their pricing strategy. But as the holiday season approaches, and big holiday feasts are a tradition to many American families, investors are questioning whether their efforts will be enough, given that they're currently observing how the second round of stockpiling has been quickly clearing shelves and consumer activity hasn't even peaked yet. During the spring, the share of sold-out packaged goods skyrocketed, and according to a recent survey by Centricity Inc., that's a platform that tracks online activity like searches and e-commerce, demand for items like baking goods has risen 3,400% from a year earlier in the 3 weeks through October 13th. Centricity's chief executive officer, Mike Brackett, said despite this figure is less than the 6,000% upsurge that preceded the first wave of pantry loading, he expects this one to hit a wider range of products beyond canned goods and other staples. Brackett disclosed, in the last 3 to 4 weeks, we've seen very drastic increases, similar to how we did with the first wave of the virus outbreak. The current pantry restock is happening at the same time as U.S. hospitalizations have registered a 2-month high last week, with 37 states reporting a substantial jump in numbers. Latin America and Europe are also documenting increased cases, which might also influence future global supply chain disruptions. Even though some companies are insisting that they're better prepared than before, shortages persist in many places. Raley's, a West Sacramento-based grocer, exposed that it's only being able to fill about 70% of its orders. Paul Ginetto, Senior Vice President of Sales and Merchandising at Raley's, said that's better than the 40% filling at the peak of the health crisis, but it also means that some shelves are still scarce. The retailer revealed that it's seeing constraints to access some packaged foods. That's why it's decided to order more private label brands in view of the expected buying rush of holiday essentials. The company foresees that massive purchasing will start earlier this year, and it intends to hold 20% more inventory than normal for some undersupplied categories. Ginetto affirmed to believe consumer hoarding behavior will be retaken, and it's already causing a little strain. The real thick of it is going to be those 10 to 14 days prior to Thanksgiving, he said in an interview. That's to say, the real struggle for food companies.
People are not asking the right questions. They're not asking the right questions because they kind of think they already know the answers.
Is not only to rebuild the inventories that were depleted at the beginning of the year, but to keep it properly restocked through the coming winter. And most importantly, to have sufficient available items after the holiday season is over. Although the second round loading might be less turbulent than the last one, General Mills said it doesn't expect its inventories to get back to normal levels until next June, considering consumers are still hoarding as much food as they can, which adds extra pressure on companies across the industry. Sean Connolly, Chief Executive Officer at Healthy Choice parent Conagra, says we're pretty much selling everything we can make, as long as demand remains very elevated, and if there is an additional uptick, that will just further stretch the supply that can be produced. However, when demand is high and the offer doesn't keep up, we do know that prices tend to soar. In other words, in the face of mass unemployment and the absence of further stimulus packages, those who still have a source of income and can afford food will have it at their tables and stockpiles, but those who don't are likely to cope with a much more unsettling reality. In fact, a survey by Feeding America, the nation's largest hunger relief organization, found that over 54 million Americans are likely to face hunger by December, which puts the country in the worst hunger calamity in history. Worldwide, an additional 100 million people or more could be facing starvation this year. One of the key challenges right now is to make sure that the health crisis doesn't turn into a hunger crisis, said Svein Tore Holstetter, the president and CEO of Norwegian fertilizer company Yara International, during the Fortune CEO Initiative virtual conference on Monday. He said, "The difficult reality right now is that we're moving in the wrong direction on hunger. The numbers are increasing. Right now, over 800 million people around the world do not have enough food and go to bed hungry, while nearly 135 million were close to starvation level before the outbreak has started," he noted. That number is doubling, and the sanitary outbreak is a key driver, Holstetter said. His warning reflected the data registered in a report on food insecurity from the United Nations in April, which documented that in 2019, 135 million were at risk of acute food insecurity in 55 countries. And in 2020, another 130 million people could be pushed into the near starvation category as a consequence of the health crisis effects on the economy. In that sense, it is staggering that the United States alone may represent.
I'm going to teach you about brain and heart coherence. And with this knowledge, what if you could strengthen your...
Present roughly 41% of this figure. In underdeveloped nations, such as South Sudan, the collapse of oil prices has dangerously resonated in people's food insecurity levels. But for the United States, all that was needed to mark a 10% increase in food insecurity and push millions of households to the poverty line were the poorly conducted shutdowns that stopped business activity. The president and CEO of Bank of the West, Nanda Bakshi, has announced that leaders need to take a different approach to best address this multi-faced crisis, saying, "Gone are the days when leaders had to know everything and had to be powerful," she said. Nanda Bakshi said, "I think it's important to show vulnerability. It's important to show empathy. All of those are extremely important to create a safe environment." Brett Taylor, president and COO at Salesforce, agreed, saying, "We're in the midst of a health crisis. We're in the midst of an economic crisis. We're in the midst of a social justice crisis, particularly here in the United States. And I think we're in the midst of a leadership crisis as well," he said. This year, the administration decided to funnel a record amount of aid to the agricultural sector, but the majority went to big farms over food workers or small-scale farmers. The results of it could be seen in a Reuters article that reported rural Americans are going hungry despite federal farm aid. Food workers are having to resort to food banks in several cities. In Wisconsin, just about 15 miles from the main food pantry, a large-scale corn and soybean farmer received $1 million in aid from the United States Department of Agriculture, the largest amount in the state, federal data shows. According to the article Crusaders of Justicia, the Manitowoc, Wisconsin-based food relief organization that served Thendajas has gone from serving 125 families a year to more than 3,000 in 2020. Feeding America data shows that the biggest increases in food insecurity were registered in North Dakota, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. What's really painful to witness is that most people struggling to put food on their tables actually work in crops and food processing plants, being surrounded every day by food that they can no longer afford, now having to rely on food assistance programs. A lot of these farmers have just so much pride that they never thought about taking that trip to a local food pantry, stated Melissa Lawson, who manages food programs for 7 counties in northwestern Wisconsin.
With all the disturbing things going on in the world right now, are you feeling fear?
Wisconsin. The administration has provided farmers almost $18 billion in direct payments since June through its CFA program. But according to a Reuters analysis of federal USDA data, 92% of small farmers in Wisconsin received less aid than it costs to run an average dairy in the state for a month. By the end of August, the federal aid wore off, and families had to deal with empty cupboards again as viral cases increased in the Midwest. Rising crop and livestock prices echoed into grocery stores. The cost of bread climbed almost 20% in June. Meat jumped 17%, according to market research firm Nielsen. While government officials are still battling over the issuance of additional stimulus, more households are falling into poverty. The Agriculture Department has handed out 9.5 million food boxes since June, under a program meant to quickly direct food to those who need it. But food pantry workers say it'll not be enough. Not long ago, Feeding America has emphasized that if this situation doesn't change, there will be a shortage of up to 8 billion meals. The U.S. Census Bureau and an annual study by the United States Department of Agriculture recently released data that shows that hunger is rising, especially in rural states, after a decade of decline. By late September, Vermont and West Virginia topped the Bureau's list, with a more than 50% rise in respondents saying they didn't have enough to eat. In short, this highlights the fact that despite some food manufacturers and grocery chains bolstering efforts to support the demand to avoid supply shortages, increasing prices, and the deteriorating conditions of the labor market will consequently interfere with people's ability to have access to these products. Food banks are completely overwhelmed, and demand doesn't stop growing. This winter might be the toughest for millions of United States families, particularly because many of those won't escape from facing starvation. Lamentably, the economic collapse effects have become so extreme that Americans are now divided into